Hi all, wishing you a very good morning. This is a continuation of our previous class. We had already discussed about the neoclassical period and already discussed about John Dryden too. So here I would like to take a detailed description or a detailed class on neoclassical period once again for you to understand it more clearly. And this class will be a clear-cut, complete class based on John Dryden and his works, especially on classical criticism as well as judicial criticism. So here I'm going to present the class on neoclassical period. What do you mean by neoclassical period? What is the definition of neoclassical period? Neoclassical period means it is something new and something novel. New classicism, right? And what is meant by new classicism? New classicism means that it is a turning back to classicist. It is a turning back to Homer, Virgil, as well as different classicists whom these people thought that they were the great mentors or the inspirators of various techniques. So, going into neoclassical period, Neoclassicism was a Western cultural movement in the decorative and visual arts, the literature, theatre, music, and architecture that drew inspiration from the art and culture of social antiquity. It was moreover found in the social antiquity, especially when there were always antique and classicist techniques that were imbibed by these modern writers. The period is called neoclassical because its writers looked back to the ideals and art forms of classical times, emphasizing even more than their Renaissance predecessors the classical ideals of order and rational control. So here you can see that before neoclassicism, the age was a Renaissance. You would have studied in your history for English literature that after Renaissance came the period of neoclassicism. After neoclassicism, you can see that there was a period of romanticism. So neoclassical period was a period in which there was a complete disorientation from the previous ages as well as it was completely distanced from the later age. So going into the next slide, Neoclassicism developed with the Enlightenment, a political and philosophical movement that primarily valued science, reason, and exploration. So, here you can see that during the Renaissance period, more importance was given to humanism, and according to Renaissance, every human being is a person who is very truthful in nature. But in classicism, or in the neoclassical period, they always satirized, they always tried to undermine, or they always tried to dig into the character of these different people. Also called the age of reason. What is the age of reason? Enlightenment, or the period of neoclassical period is known as the age of truth and reason, and therefore this truth and reason had come from the age of enlightenment, and this enlightenment period is known as the age of reason. So, also called as the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment was informed by the skepticism of the noted philosopher René Descartes and the political philosophy of John Locke as the absolutes of the monarchy. They always looked forward to the philosophers such as René Descartes as well as John Locke in order to imbibe or in order to make their own philosophical thoughts. Now, religious dogmas were fundamentally questioned, and the ideals of individual liberty, religious tolerance, and constitutional governments were advanced. It was a period of the Commonwealth. It was a period in which there was restoration. It was a period in which everything was questioned, and they always tried to find the truth behind everything. So, behind this neoclassical period, you can see that there was always a hunting of new or truthful information. Next slide. Neoclassical literature was written between 1660 and 1798. This time period is broken down into three parts: the Restoration period, the Augustan period, and the Age of Johnson. So it had three parts. What are they? The Restoration period, the Augustan period, and the Age of Johnson. Which Johnson? Samuel Johnson. Writers of the neoclassical period tried to imitate the style of the Romans and the Greeks. Romans and the Greeks. Last day I asked a question. What was the name which was given to the poets in Rome and Greece? What was the answer? It was Waits. So these people looked upon the poets or the writers as godly human beings or godly beings. They were also liminal beings or godly beings. So here you can see that the writers of the neoclassical period, they tried to imitate the style of the Romans and the Greeks. So it is also called the age of prose and reason. This was the age in which you can see that there was a flowering of prose. A lot of prose writers had been born. A lot of prose had been written. Can you name some of the prose writers of this period, Restoration Age? You might have studied in history of English literature. Nobody will be even imagining that I'll be asking this question here, right? So if I ask you about the prose writers of the period, you can see that the prose writers are Addison, Steele, Samuel Johnson, Dryden. Everybody used to write prose during this period. Prose was dominant during this period. Poetry was there, but poetry was in the more way of sarcasm. Okay, mock epics were more prominent during this period. And can you name some of the books that was written in the prose? It was Jonathan Swift's, you can see, Jonathan Swift's Battle of the Books. It was a book that was written in the prosaic form, and this book, it had the war between the ancients and the moderns. It was like a true war, like the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. There was a war between the Romans and the ancients. Even the Virgil and Homer were also in the war front. Okay, and you can see in the case of poetry, you can see that there was a hell lot of poems. There was a lot of poems in the form of satire or mock epics, some of which was the Rape of the Lock. The Rape of the Lock by whom? Who wrote The Rape of the Lock? Please find it. Okay. Everything I won't be saying everything for you. So, Macflecknoe. Who wrote Macflecknoe? Macflecknoe was written by John Dryden. Yes. Then you are having Absalom and Achitophel. It was also written by John Dryden. So, you have to, the thing is that you have to find who wrote what? The Rape of the Lock. The Rape of the Lock was written by? You should have to find it. Okay. Now the next one, it is also called the age of prose and reason. Literature of the age is concerned with nature. What nature? Human nature. Supremacy of reason was there. Unity in the work of all the writers. The age is known as the classical age because it was an age in which there were a lot of brilliant people. There were brilliant philosophers. There were brilliant thinkers during this age. And these people thought that all the Elizabethan poetry was just a dustbin or just some garbage. It was nothing worth of the reading. Now the term the Augustan age, so this is also a term that was deciphered for this particular period, the Augustan age. The Augustan age comes from the self-conscious imitation of the original Augustan writers. So during the time of the Augustan, King Augustus, or the man who ruled over the particular Rome, you can see that these writers used to imitate the writers of the Augustan period. And these writers were Virgil and Horace, by many of the writers of the modern period. Now, next slide. The major writers of the age, I've told you earlier, the major writers of the age was Alexander Pope and John Dryden. Can you say who wrote the Rape of the Lock? The Rape of the Lock was written by Sir whom? You should have to find, please. Okay, whatever it is. In poetry, and Jonathan Swift and Joseph Addison in prose. It is not addition, it is addition. I'm sorry for the mistake. Now, next one. Dryden forms the link between restoration and Augustan literature. What is restoration? Restoration of restoring Charles II to the throne. There was a dethroning of the particular king, and later on he was thrown back. He was given his own position, and that is known as restoration. And therefore, Dryden, you can see that he was a link between the restoration and the Augustan literature. The neoclassical period of literature can be divided into three stages, as I've told you earlier. The first one is the Restoration period, then the Augustan period, and the age of Johnson. This period marks the British king's restoration to the throne after a long period of Puritan domination in England. Its symptoms include the dominance of French and classical influences on poetry and drama. There was also the influence of French and classical writings in this particular period. Okay. Then going to the next slide. The famous writers in the period. Who are the famous writers in the period? The famous writers in the period are John Dryden, Samuel Johnson, John Milton, Sir William Temple, John Locke, Jonathan Swift, Joseph Addison, Samuel Johnson, Thomas Gray. Thomas Gray, the famous poem ഏതാണ്? The elegy written in the country churchyard. He was a pre-romantic. He was a precursor of romantic. So John Dryden was there. John Dryden wrote Absalom and Achitophel. He also wrote the work which is known as Macflagno, and some of his treatises or the critical pieces were prefaced to the fables, as the essay of dramatic poesy, etc. Now, next person, Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson is famous for his dictionary, which was written in the year 1755. Then John Milton. You can see that John Milton was a famous poet who wrote about Paradise Lost in 12 books and Paradise Regained also in 12 books. Then you can see there is Sir William Temple, who is the mentor of who? Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift in the mentor ആണ് Sir William Temple, and in order to support William Temple, Jonathan Swift had written the Battle of the Books. Then you have John Locke, which is famous theory of tabula rasa. He says that every person born in this world is like a blank slate, and whatever we are doing now is something that is studied during the years in which we were born. Okay. Then you have Jonathan Swift, as said earlier, Joseph Addison, and you have the Tattlers or the periodical essays. Then you have Samuel Johnson, that's a repetition, I'm sorry, and there is Thomas Gray. The neoclassical era in literature brought a sense of decorum and stability to the writers. Everybody wrote almost in the same way. There were rules to be carefully followed, and there was a structure of writing to be upheld. People praised wit and parody as well, something that was important. There was always wit, parody, satire, mock epics, everything was there in this, flourished during this period. It is the first great age of literary criticism, where essays on the virtues and the weaknesses of authors and biographies of major figures began to dominate. There was also biographies by James Boswell. James Boswell wrote about some biographies, and also there was also the essays which are based on the different virtues and vices and weaknesses of different authors. Now you can see here that John Dryden, the father of English criticism. Okay, the John Dryden is known as the father of English criticism. And who called John Dryden like that? It was Samuel Johnson who called John Dryden the father of English criticism. It was Samuel Johnson. Samuel Johnson called John Dryden the father of English criticism. Now, John Dryden. He was born in the year 1631 and he lived up to 1700, and he is rightly considered as the father of English criticism. He was the first to teach the English people to determine the merit of composition upon principles. With Dryden, a new era of criticism began. He brought about a new era. There was a new dawn of criticism. Before Dryden, there were only occasional utterances on the critical art. Of course, before Dryden, you can see that there were people who wrote about criticism. There was the first English critic, especially Philip Sidney. Don't confuse Philip Sidney with John Dryden. Philip Sidney is the first English critic, and John Dryden is the father of English criticism. Okay. Except an essay of dramatic poesy. Essay of dramatic poesy is his famous work. Dryden wrote no formal treatise on criticism. Except this, he did not write any formal treatise on criticism. His critical views are found mostly in the preface to his poetical works or to those of others. Some of the critical writings that he wrote was in the foreword or the preface of the various works that he had written, especially the poetical works. Nature of poetry. Dryden upholds Aristotle's definition of poetry as a process of imitation. It imitates facts, past or present, popular beliefs, superstitions, and things in their ideal form. Yes, of course, it is an imitation, but it is an imitation in itself. There is something novel or creative within that imitation. That is what he says. Function of poetry. The final end of poetry, according to Dryden, is to delight and transport rather than to instruct. To realize it, it does not merely imitate life but offers its own of it, a beautiful resemblance of the whole. So here you can see that when a poet imitates a particular nature or particular form, you can see that he also puts in something original in it. അയാളുടെ കയ്യിലുള്ള എന്തൊക്കെയോ ഒറിജിനൽ പീസുകൾ കൂടി ഇയാൾ അതിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് ഇട്ട് കൊടുക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. സോ ദാറ്റ് ഈസ് വാട്ട് Dryden says here. The poet is neither a teacher nor a bare imitator, but is a creator. He is one who, with life or nature as his raw material, produces a new thing altogether, resembling the original in its basis but different from it in the superstructure, a work of art rather than a copy. He creates something that is new and novel. Drama claimed most of Dryden's attention. That is why he wrote the essay, an essay of dramatic poesy. And here you can go on to the next slide. Dryden the Critique. Okay. Dr. Johnson, in his book The Lives of English Poets, calls Dryden the father of English criticism. He says, who says? Samuel Johnson says, Dryden may be popularly considered as the father of English criticism, as the writer who first taught us to determine upon principles the merit of composition. He taught the merit of composition to different people. He did not say about the various different scenarios that was present before him, but he laid down a new set of rules for him. Okay, and that is why he is teaching some principles based on how a work should be judged. First English critic to make use of historical criticism. So his work is historical, his work is judgmental. He is the first judicial critic, he is the first historical critic in English literature. So he regarded literature as a mirror to the society, reflecting the characteristics of that age. Literature changes with age and place. He says that different times always make different literature. The best contribution lies in the modification of ancient doctrines in the light of modernity. He says that everything should be in composition, or everything should be in adherence with the classical principles. There was a perfect fusion of critic and an artist in him. There was a perfect fusion of a critic and an artist in him. He appreciates Shakespeare and Johnson in his essay of dramatic poesy, which was written in the year 1669. So he wrote the work, an essay of dramatic poesy, in the year 1669, and he studies Chaucer in his preface to the Fables, which was his last work, which is written in the year 1700. Okay, how and what he wrote. So what you are going to deal with here is how and what he wrote. So what is that he is doing here? How and what he wrote is, I'm sorry for all those things here. Okay. How and what he wrote. Dryden's principal critic work is his essay of dramatic poesy, though his critical observations are also found in the prefaces to several of his works, especially in the preface to the Fables. So, his most important work is his essay of dramatic poesy, which was written in the year 1669. The critical piece. The essay of dramatic poesy establishes him as the first historical critic, first comparative critic, first descriptive critic, and then independent English critic. So, as I told you earlier, he was everything. He was the first English historical critic, he was the first English comparative critic, he was the first English descriptive critic, and he was the first independent English critic. The essay of dramatic poesy is developed in the form of dialogues among four interlocutors. Four people are dialoguing, four people are talking or conversing among themselves. So, this particular essay is in the form of a dialogue. And these people, the interlocutors, the people who are conversing, are representing the four different literatures or literary ages. He intended to lay down the theory of drama and to judge how far the Greek, Latin, and French dramatists were held to be superior could withstand his test. He put forward a test in order to find who is the best literature, or which country is having the best literature of the age, and he says that this particular test, whoever will be withstanding this particular test will be the winner. He tests if these dramas, he is putting this test for a particular drama. He tests if these dramas were truly superior to the English dramatist or mistakenly taken so, which places French and classical. So he wanted to test the French and classical dramas along with the English drama and to see which of them is the superior one. Type of criticism. In this way, that is Dryden, develops historical, comparative, and descriptive forms of criticism and finally gives his own independent views through the replies of Neander. So, in this place, in this particular thing, you can see that there are four interlocutors, and among the four interlocutors, Dryden says his opinion through the viewpoint of a person named as Neander. So, Neander is the person who stands for Dryden. Situation in the treatise. There is a particular situation in the treatise. The treatise is that four people are there rowing a boat, ഒരു ബോട്ടിൽ പോയിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുക, and these people wanted to start a conversation based on this, and so this treatise is born. So, situation in the treatise. On the day that the English fleet encounters the Dutch at sea near the mouth of the Thames, the four friends take a barge downriver towards the noise from the battle. Rightly concluding, as the noise subsides, the English have triumphed. They order the bargeman to row them back upriver as they begin a dialogue on the advances made by modern civilization. They agree to measure progress by comparing ancient arts with modern, focusing specially on the art of drama. And Thus is dramatic poesy born. So there was a particular war there, and these people rode towards this war in order to watch it. And later, when the war is over, the English people wins the war, and when they come up the river of the Thames, they start a conversation in order to find who is the best. The four interlocutors. The four interlocutors are Crites, Lycidius, Eugenius, and Neander. So the first person, Crites. Crites speak for the ancient dramatist. Lycidius speak for the French. Eugenius speak for the English literature of the past age, and Neander speaks for England and liberty. So who are they? Crites, who speak for the ancients, Lycidius, who speak for the French, and Eugenius, who speak for the ancient English writers, and Neander, who speaks for the England and the liberty. Crites, spokesman for the ancients, establish superiority of the ancient dramatists on moderns based on the founders of dramatic genre. He says that the classicists or the ancients, they were the spokesman, or they were the founders of the dramatic genre. Then they are held in high esteemed position in Greece. The natural and real nature that is embedded in the various dramas. Then you have modern dramas following the rules of the ancients. Three dramatic unities were invented by them: language, style, literary devices, and figures of speech was also invented by them. And he says that the moderns are the imitators of the ancients. So Crites always speak for the ancients. Eugenius defends the moderns or the French. Okay. He says about the improved rules and practices of the ancients. Ancients had defects. Plots and characters of comedy of the ancients were stock. They were not having any fluctuating character. They are not moving. Stock and just theoremite. They are having no character appraisal. Okay. Then dramatic unities are not observed by the ancients. Then you have the excess of speech than action, and there is no poetic justice. Something poetic justice means that sometimes the villains win. So there is no poetic justice. If the ancients had lived in the time of the moderns, they would have supported them too. So he says that if the ancients lived during the period of the moderns, then they would have supported them too. So what is here? Crites says for the ancients, Eugenius says for the moderns. Now the next person is Lycidius. He says for the French dramatist. I'm sorry, I think I said about Eugenius as for the French dramatist. I'm sorry about that. Now, Lycidius, he stands for the French dramatist. He says that the French drama is superior to the modern drama and ancient drama, superior to the ancients and moderns in observing the three unities. The French drama always follows the three unities. They wrote either tragedies or comedies and not absolute tragic comedies. They did not say anything mixing tragedy and comedy. Either they wrote tragedy or they wrote comedy. Then they derived plots from incidents popular with the masses. There was narrative skill which was very superb, and plot development more logical and natural. The plot development during their period was more natural and more logical. And they also used beautiful rhymes, and they did not use blank verse. So rhyme was something that they had written. It was not in blank verse. Blank verse means that blank verse doesn't have any kind of a rhyme. Neander. Neander defends England and liberty. Who is Neander? It was Dryden. Dryden defends England and liberty. He says about the superiority of English dramatists over the French. English drama is natural while the French drama is artificial. Then he says, defends the practice of writing tragic comedies. He says that tragic comedy is life. Life is a mixture of tragedy as well as comedy, and therefore dramas in England is a mixture of tragedy and comedy, and which is very natural. He says that the drama in English had a variety of taste and themes. Large number of different characters are introduced. Violence and stage and its representation on stage is also there. For example, in King Lear, you can say that Shakespeare, he represents violence on the stage. And also you can see in the modern writers of the English period, there is also violence on the stage. There is always war on the stage, and he says that violence on the stage is very much effective in bringing out the natural environment in that particular drama. If English dramatists show too much violence on the stage, the French show too little of it. They show only very little violence. The French dramatists too are bound with the rules, while the English dramatists enjoy a kind of freedom. So before you can see that Lycidius, he says that the French dramatists, they follow the three unities, but here Dryden says that the French follow the unities and they are having a set of rules to follow. But in the case of English dramatists, they do not have any such rules, and therefore they enjoy a lot of freedom. Now, Neander or Dryden's appreciation. So Dryden here appreciates Shakespeare as the best dramatist of his period. He hails Ben Jonson as the most learned and judicious dramatist. Can you tell me some of the works of Ben Jonson? Men out of his humor, men in his humor, everything is there. He was a humorist. He says about the comedy of the humors. He was a person who invented the comedy of humors. Okay, so Beaumont and Fletcher are two dramatists, and these people are always in coordination. They always write dramas along with each other. Okay, and the thing with the famous characteristic with Beaumont and Fletcher is that their dramas are full of violence. Okay, so here Beaumont and Fletcher's plots were more regular than of Shakespeare's. He also takes up the controversy of blank verse. He supports rhyming verse. He says that blank verse is not poetry but poetic prose which had to be used only in serious plays. He says that blank verse should be said in serious plays and not in some irrelevant or trivial plays. And also he supports rhyming poetry. Okay. Then Dryden's views. He respects the ancient Greek and Roman principles, but he refuses to adhere to them slavishly, especially in respect of tragic comedy and the observance of the three dramatic unities. Of course, he says that all these things are very good. In the case of classical dramatists, these things are very good, but I do not adhere. I will not adhere to the three unities. Thus, Dryden began a great regular era of criticism and showed the way to his countrymen how to be great as creative authors as well as creative evaluators, and what makes great literature. He is a writer, he is a particular person who wrote poetry. He wrote drama. He wrote also prose. He wrote criticism. So he tried his hand at everything, and therefore he knows what is literature. And therefore he says, or he shows his countrymen what great literature should be, how great literature should be considered, how it can be found. Thus, he is indeed called as the father of English criticism. Yes, therefore, he is rightly called as the father of English criticism. Now, the criticism of Dryden. According to Dryden, a critic has to understand that a writer writes to his own age and people of which he himself is a product. A writer writes about a particular age. Literature is the depiction of life. Therefore, the writer writing in the Shakespearean period will write about the environment in Shakespeare. A writer writing in the World War I will write about the particular instances. A writer who is writing about the current corona scenario. He will be writing about post-pandemic literature. Okay, so each writer will be having a definite writing of his own. He advocates a close study of the ancient models and not to imitate them blindly as a thoroughgoing neoclassicist would do, but to recapture their magic, to treat them as a torch to enlighten our passage. He says that you shouldn't imitate the classical writers, but instead you should have to make them as rules, or makes them as a torch in order to light our passage. It is the spirit of the classics that makes matters more than their rules. It is the spirit that was there in the ancient classicists that you should have to take into consideration, and not the rules that they were seemingly saying. Dryden mentions the appropriate rules laid down by Aristotle, but it is not the observance of rules that makes a work great, but its capacity to delight and to transport. It is not the business of criticism to detect petty faults, but to discover those great beauties that make it immortal. He says that a particular critic is a person who should not only focus on the faults of a particular writer, but he also should have to find the different beauties that make the particular writer and the work immortal. Reinstating Dryden's views. In general, English literary criticism before Dryden was ill organized and heavily leaning on the ancient Greek and Roman and more recent Italian and French criticism. There was nothing new in English criticism. Of course, Philip Sidney was there. Philip Sidney wrote something, but he did not write something according to the mind of the English people. So the first English criticism was written by John Dryden. Then it had no identity or even life of its own. What? English criticism did not have any identity or life of its own before Dryden. Moreover, an overwhelming proportion of it was criticism of the legislative and little of the descriptive kind. Before Dryden, it was legislative criticism, it was descriptive criticism, but Dryden made it a judicial criticism. Dryden evolved and articulated an impressive body of critical principles for practical literary appreciation and offered good examples of descriptive criticism. He laid down different principles and he laid down several rules to understand the different criticism himself. Concluding, you can say that as Emperor Augustus found Rome, the kingdom of Rome, in brick and left it marble. ബ്രിക്കിൽ കണ്ട് മാർബിളിൽ ഉണ്ടാക്കിയതാണ് റോം. ആര്? King Augustus. In the same way, we can say that Dryden found English criticism in brick and left it with marble. So we can see that Dryden has a definite role of his own in order to play. And with this, we are concluding our dramatic poesy and Dryden. Thank you for bearing with me. Thanks a lot. And I hope that all of you understood. Thank you for being here. Stay safe during this corona period. Be safe. And if you are having any doubts, please feel free in order to ask me. Okay. Thank you.